December 17, 1944. The sound of monsters, the ground shook long before we saw them. Deep, mechanical growls rolled through the Ardennes forest, echoing off the frozen hills. It wasn't thunder, it was the Maybach engines of German Tigers crawling toward us through the snow. That sound alone could freeze a man's soul. Every vibration reminded us that somewhere out there, in the white silence, death was moving closer. I was the radio operator in M for Sherman, one of the so-called steel coffins. The name was no exaggeration. Against a Tiger, we might as well have been made of tin. Our armor couldn't stop their shells, and our 75mm gun barely scratched their high, unless we got dangerously close. Still, we rolled forward, our breath fogging up the cold glass of our scopes, pretending courage, while every bone in our bodies begged us to run. That morning, frost coated everything, the barrels, the treads, even the dog tags hanging from my neck. The forest smelled of oil, iron, and fear. Somewhere ahead, another American platoon had gone silent. The radio crackled with half-words and static. Command said the Tigers were pushing north. We didn't need the confirmation, the earth itself was already warning us. We moved out in formation, our tanks second in line. The first German ahead of us disappeared into the fog, and seconds later, a flash. The blast ripped through the haze like a curtain of fire. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but twisted metal and blackened snow. No screams, just silence. I felt my throat tighten. Every instinct told me we were next. The Tiger's shell could hit us from a mile away, we couldn't even see them yet. They always struck first, invisible, precise, methodical. We were fighting ghosts made of steel. I adjusted the radio, trying to reach command, but all I got was static, sharp, painful static that cut through the cabin like shards of ice. The captain barked for updates, his voice calm but his hands trembling slightly on the turret handles. I pretended not to notice, we all did. The closer the rumble grew, the more unreal everything felt. It was like waiting for an avalanche, knowing there's no way to stop it. I could almost feel the Tiger's gun turning in our direction, hear its mechanical heartbeat counting down the seconds. When we finally saw them, my stomach dropped. 3 Tigers, black silhouettes against the blinding white, emerged from the trees. Their armor gleamed under the weak winter sun, thick and unbreakable. They advanced slowly, deliberately, confident. We fired first. The shell hit one of them straight on the hull and bounced off. The Tiger answered. The impact shook our world apart. The shockwave slammed me against the radio panel, sparks jumping across the dials. The turret crew shouted. Someone's hand was bleeding. We reversed desperately, treads grinding over frozen roots. Another shot hit nearby, throwing snow and dirt into the air like a storm. Through the periscope, I saw one of our Shermans burning, its crew trying to crawl out through the flames. The heat warped the metal, and their screams were swallowed by the howling wind. I gripped the radio handset tighter, my breath ragged. That was the first day I truly understood fear, not the kind that comes from danger, but the kind that comes from hopelessness. We were outgunned, outmatched, and outnumbered, and yet, somehow, I was still alive. As night fell and we retreated into the forest, I kept hearing the low growl of the Tigers in my head. Even in silence, I could still feel the ground tremble. I didn't know it yet, but that sound, the sound of monsters, would be what drove me to change everything. December 19, 1944. Of tin and courage. They called us brave, but bravery had nothing to do with it. We were just too stubborn or too scared to stop fighting. Each day felt like a borrowed one. Every patrol another roll of dice against the inevitable. Our Shermans clanked and rattled like fragile toys, and we knew exactly what we were sitting in. Thin steel, or roaring engine, and a prayer. When a Tiger appeared on the horizon, it was never a fair fight. Its 88mm gun could tear through us long before we were even close enough to aim properly. From over 1,000 meters away, it could pick us off like we were practice targets. We had to creep forward, find cover, and try to hit their sides or rear weak spots so small they felt like illusions. It was David against Goliath, yes, but David had no faith left, just frostbitten fingers and trembling hands. The cold bit harder with every sunrise. Frost coated the barrels and turned the oil in the engine sluggish, even breathing felt heavy. When I spoke into the radio, the metal pressed against my lips burned like fire. Inside the tank, The air was thick with the smell of diesel and fear. Sweat froze on our collars, and our breath clouded the interior until everything was wrapped in mist. Our unit had already lost 3 tanks that week. Each explosion left a void on the radio net, cow signs gone mid-sentence, replaced by silence. You didn't ask what happened, you already knew. One morning, before dawn, our captain gathered us outside the tank. Snow crunched under his boots, and the glow of his cigarette looked almost warm. He said we'd hold the line near a small Belgian village, nothing more than a few stone houses and a frozen well. If we retreat again, he said, they'll roll straight to the river. We nodded, but none of us believed we'd stop them. When we moved out, the sky was a pale gray curtain, heavy with snow. Visibility was poor, perfect for ambushes. We set up behind a ridge overlooking the road. I listened through the headset, static whispering like ghosts in my ears. Somewhere beyond the trees, a tiger prowled. I could feel it before I heard it. The rumble started soft, then grew metal, grinding against frozen mud, the distinct rhythm of treads too heavy for the earth. Our gunner tensed. Contact front, he muttered. The turret began to turn, slow and deliberate. My hands hovered over the radio dials, listening for any order from command, but the airwaves were empty. Then, a flash in the distance, the Tiger fired first. The shell missed by inches, exploding behind us and showering the Sherman with dirt and ice. The captain shouted coordinates. We returned fire 1, 2 shots, our shells striking its armor and doing nothing but wake the beast. Another blast, the ground shook. The Tiger's shell hit the ridge in front of us, carving a crater big enough to swallow a jeep. Our driver reversed hard, gears grinding, the engine screaming. I braced myself against the panel, heart hammering. Suddenly, over the static, I caught another voice, a familiar one. Another Sherman crew, pinned down a mile south, begging for support. I relayed their position, my voice cracking. They're blind down there, I said. They don't see the Tiger flanking them. But before the captain could respond, the radio went dead. Just a long, cruel hiss of static. For the next few minutes, the world was chaos. The Tiger pushed forward, firing methodically, one round after another. We returned everything we had, hitting smoke and snow. Never the target, and yet we stay. Not because we thought we could win, but because leaving meant someone else would die instead of us. When the Tiger finally withdrew, probably low on ammunition, we were left in the cratered snow, shaking, exhausted, surrounded by silence. Our tank's side was scorched, one track was damaged. The captain climbed out, surveyed the field, and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. That night, as the engine idled weakly and frost crept across the glass, I thought about courage. It wasn't medals or speeches or victory parades. It was staying in that frozen coffin, heart pounding, when every instinct screamed to run. It was hearing the sound of a Tiger's gun and refusing to look away. We were made of tin, yes. But inside, somewhere beneath the fear and exhaustion, something still burned, something that wouldn't let us stop. December 22, 1944. The white hell. Snow had stopped falling, but the world was still white. White like blindness, white like death hiding in plain sight. Every shape, every shadow, every frozen tree trunk looked like the muzzle of a tiger waiting to fire. The forest of the Ardennes was no longer alive, it was a graveyard muffled under snow. The radio crackled with fragments of voices, none clear enough to understand. Sometimes I wondered if I was hearing ghosts. Entire platoons had vanished without a word, their last transmissions buried under static. Our own tank stank of burned oil and sweat, and the metal floor never stopped vibrating. I could feel the hum of the engine in my chest like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The cold was an enemy all on its own. My gloves were stiff as wood, and the inside of my jacket was damp from the melting frost. The gunner, Miller, kept rubbing his hands together until the skin cracked. "Cold keeps you sharp," he said once, but it didn't. It dulled you. It made your thoughts slow, heavy, trapped somewhere behind the ache of frozen bones. That morning, we rolled through what was left of a small village. Only chimneys were standing. The snow was piled over what used to be walls and windows. A child's sled lay half buried in the ruins. No laughter, no people, just the wind howling through what used to be life. I couldn't look for long. The captain ordered us to keep moving. We were part of a screening force meant to delay the German armor. Delay? not stop. We knew what that meant. Somewhere behind us, the artillery thundered like an angry sky. But out here, it was just us 5 men in a steel box, surrounded by silence. I checked the radio again, only static. The command frequency was empty, as if the whole war had moved on without us. By midday, the snow started again, heavier this time. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I could barely see the tank ahead, just its exhaust plume mixing with the white mist. Then, faintly, I heard it, the deep, familiar growl that made every nerve in me tighten. Tigers. The sound came from our left flank. Not close yet, but coming. The captain whispered into his throat mic, ordering us to halt. The driver killed the engine. The silence that followed was unbearable. We sat there, holding our breath, while the distant rumble grew louder. Through the periscope, I saw a flash of movement between the trees. Then another. Their formation was perfect, slow, steady, deliberate. The lead Tiger's gun swept the woods like an eye searching for prey. I could almost hear the hydraulics turning. I prayed it wouldn't see us first. Our gunner aligned the turret, breath fogging the sight. Target, maybe 600 meters, he murmured. The captain hesitated. He knew the odds. One shot would give away our position. But doing nothing meant waiting for death. Fire. The blast inside the tank made my ears ring. The shell hit the Tiger's side armor, but all it did was spark. The German tank turned instantly, its gun traversing toward us like a hunting beast. Reverse, reverse now, the captain yelled. The tread screamed as we backed into the woods, a flash then a thunderclap. The Tiger's shell missed by yards, sending snow and dirt raining over us. We kept moving, blind, desperate, sliding over frozen roots until the engine nearly stalled. When we finally stopped, I could still hear the Tigers, distant but moving. They didn't chase us. They didn't need to. They knew we'd be here tomorrow, weaker, colder, fewer. As night fell, the radio came alive again, just faint voices, somewhere far away, calling for reinforcements that would never come. I listened for hours, trying to catch a familiar name, a word, anything. Instead, I heard only the endless hum of the airwaves, like the war itself was breathing through the static. It was there, amid that noise, that the first spark of an idea flickered in my head. Something about the wiring, the feedback, the strange interference that sometimes picked up distant chatter. It made no sense than just a desperate, flickering thought in the middle of the white hell. That spark would become the only light left in the darkness. December 24, 1944. The radio failure. It started as a whisper of static, nothing unusual. The cold had a way of biting into the wires, freezing the contacts, turning the simplest signal into noise. But that morning, when I tried to reach command, there was nothing at all, no voice, no hiss. Just silence and empty, hollow silence that pressed against my ears like the weight of the snow outside. We were on patrol near the edge of a pine forest, following a narrow trail carved through the ice. The air smelled of smoke and burned fuel from battles we hadn't even seen. I tapped the side of the radio panel, then checked the cables under the seat. Loose. Everything was loose. The vibrations, the cold, the constant shocks of movement, they'd torn the wiring to shreds. The captain glanced back. "Can you fix it?" he asked, his tone more tired than angry. I told him I'd try. The truth was, I had no idea how. I wasn't an engineer, just a farm kid who'd learned to press buttons and turn knobs. But when you're in a Sherman, the difference between fixing and failing isn't technical, it's survival. I crawled under the panel, my fingers numb and clumsy. The air inside the tank was thick with fumes, and the engine's hum vibrated through my skull. Sparks danced as I pulled one of the cables loose. The insulation had cracked open, and the copper was exposed. I looked around for something, anything I could use. There was a roll of black tape, a spare fuse, and a piece of wire from the toolkit. That was all. I stripped the wire with my knife, twisting it around the connector until it held. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't even safe. It was desperation with a dash of hope. When I finished, I sealed it with tape and gave the set a hard knock for good luck. The lights blinked to life, faint but steady. "Radio's back," I said. The captain nodded and ordered me to re-establish contact with command. I turned the dial slowly, the headset pressed against my ear. At first, it was the usual Allied chatter units calling coordinates, supply requests, occasional burst of code. Then, out of nowhere, something strange cut through. A sharp click, then voices fast, harsh, unfamiliar. Not English, German. At first I thought it was interference, maybe a reflection dancing through the mountains. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. Distorted words, numbers, directions, the Tigers. Their frequency was bleeding through ours. My heart began to race. I adjusted the tuning knob slightly, isolating the channel. The signals strengthened. I could hear them coordinating movements, giving grid references. One word repeated often: Panzerkampfwagen, tanks. I called the captain immediately. He leaned over, frowning. "You sure?" he asked. I handed him the headset. His eyes widened as he listened. Then, without hesitation, he barked for the driver to halt. We sat in the snow, engine idling, while he scribbled the coordinates I'd translated from their words. 5 minutes later, we changed course, the other to Shermans, and our patrol followed. We flanked left, keeping the tree line between us and the open valley. The captain ordered the guns ready. Then we saw a Tiger sitting half-hidden near a burned-out house, its turret facing the wrong way. They hadn't spotted us yet. We fired first. The shell hit its rear plate and tore through the engine. The explosion sent a plume of black smoke spiraling into the white sky. It was over in seconds. For the first time, a Tiger had fallen and we were still breathing. Inside the tank, none of us spoke. Miller just stared at the wreck through the periscope, his jaw slack. The captain finally broke the silence. "What the hell did you do to that radio?" I looked at the twisted wire and the bit of tape holding it together. I didn't have an answer. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was a fluke. Or maybe, somehow, I had stumbled onto something the war hadn't seen yet. That night, as snow fell softly over the battlefield, I lay awake inside the frozen hull, listening to the faint hum of the radio. Every now and then, through the static, I still heard the Germans talking. And a thought began to form, a dangerous, reckless thought that would soon change everything. December 25, 1944. The voices of the Germans, Christmas morning. Back home, they were probably waking to the smell of coffee and pine needles, wrapping paper rustling by the fire. Out here, the world was made of ice, steel, and smoke. The sky was gray as gunmetal, and the only gifts we expected were shells. We were still in the same patch of forest, the Sherman half buried in snow. The radio's strange accident the day before hadn't left my mind. The thought that I could hear the anima listen to their orders like whispers from the other side felt impossible, like touching a ghost. Yet there it was, a hum of foreign voices, sometimes clear, sometimes drowned in static. When I switched the set back on that morning, the same channel came alive almost instantly. German again. My heart pounded as I leaned closer, scribbling what I could on a torn mat. "They're moving east," I said to the captain. "Coordinates sound like Hill 217. He froze, eyes narrowing. That hill was less than 2 miles from our position. He ordered silence. Even the engine was caught. The world went still, save for the soft, mechanical buzz of the radio and the faint clatter of ice shifting off the turret. The men listened as I translated, halting, clumsy, but enough. The Germans were calling tank positions, adjusting formation, planning to advance right into our path. "Get the other Shermans ready," the captain said quietly. Within 20 minutes, we were moving, the snow crunching beneath our treads. I stayed glued to the radio, headset clamped tight, feeding updates as the German voices grew louder. They had no idea we were listening. To them, the air was safe. To us, it was a map written in sound. We reached a bend in the forest road where the ground sloped into an open clearing. The snow was deep, and the air smelled of frost and burned rubber. The captain raised his hand, signaling us to stop. "They'll come through here," I whispered. He just nodded. Then came the low growl, deep, steady, unmistakable. Tigers. I could hear 3 engines. My chest tightened as their silhouettes appeared through the fog. Massive, methodical, crawling forward like predators testing the air. "Wait for my mark," the captain murmured. Our gunner adjusted the turret, barrel rising slightly. The radio buzzed with fresh orders, one of the German commanders giving precise coordinates. I recognized a word: "Rats, right." They were about to turn. "Now," the captain said. The first shot hit the lead Tiger on its flank. The shell detonated beneath the turret, and flames shot from its rear. The second Sherman fired almost instantly, striking the second Tiger before it could swing its gun toward us. The third tried to back up, but the snow trapped its treads. Within seconds, it was chaos fire, smoke, and the echo of our own guns bouncing through the trees. The German radio frequency exploded in panic. Voices shouted over each other commands, curses, confusion. I listened as their discipline fell apart, one voice crying out coordinates, another screaming for cover. It was the first time I'd ever heard fear in their tone. When the smoke cleared, 3 Tigers lay still. The forest stank of fuel and burning rubber. For the first time in weeks, we had struck first and won. The captain climbed down from the hatch, his face pale but calm. "How the hell did you know they'd be there?" he asked. I told him the truth, about the wiring, the tape, the voices. For a moment, he just stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Then, slowly, he began to smile. That night, we camped near the ruins of the battle. The snow glowed faintly under the moonlight, and the wrecks of the Tigers steamed in the cold. The men called it a miracle. Miller said I'd turned the radio into a weapon, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I still heard those voices in my head, the Germans, unaware that their words had betrayed them. It wasn't luck anymore, it was something far stranger. And I knew I had to push it further. December 27, 1944. The stupid trick. I spent the next 2 days staring at that radio like it was some kind of living thing. Every flicker of static, every hum through the wires felt like a pulse, an invisible heartbeat whispering secrets from across the snow. The others thought it was luck, a glitch, but I knew better. Something in that broken connection had changed the way the radio listened. And I was going to figure out why. The captain let me experiment during downtime. He didn't understand the technical side, but after the ambush on Christmas morning, he trusted the results. I pulled the radio apart on the floor of the tank, wires cold like veins in the dim light. The smell of oil mixed with the metallic tang of the freezing air. My fingers shook from cold and exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. The original wiring was meant to keep signals clean, shielded from interference. My accidental repair had done the opposite. The damaged insulation and twisted copper created cross-interference, letting nearby frequencies bleed together. It was chaos, but chaos had given us ears in enemy airwaves, so I started to recreate it deliberately. I stripped a longer piece of wire and connected it from the antenna base directly to the transmitter coil, bypassing the stabilizer circuit. The current hissed faintly, alive with static. Miller peered over my shoulder and said, "That looks like it'll fry the whole damn tank." I grinned and told him that if it did, we'd at least die smarter than yesterday. When I switched it on, the radio came alive, instantly louder, sharper. English voices, command chatter, then beneath it, faint but clear. German again, to channels blending into one storm of sound. I fine-tuned the dial, heart pounding, words formed through the chaos, orders, ranges, reports. Not just Tigers, trucks, infantry, their entire network, bleeding through the air. I turned to the captain, who was watching with that half-smile he used when something both impressed and terrified him. "You're telling me that mess of wire is doing this?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said. "It's stupid, but it works." He stared at the glowing panel, then shook his head slowly. "Then keep it stupid." The next patrol we ran was our first real test. We advanced north, through a corridor of snow-choked roads and shattered trees. The sky hung low and heavy, threatening more snow. I kept my headset on the whole way, tuning between Allied and German chatter. The difference was like night and day. Theirs crisp, organized, confident. They were hunting again, certain they had the upper hand, but we were listening. About an hour in, I caught them talking about moving armor through a nearby crossroads less than a mile from us. The captain ordered us to stop. He relayed the position to 2 other Shermans in our column. Together, we crept into position, guns ready, engines whispering. Through the periscope, I saw them first 2 Tigers and an armored half-track, cutting across the clearing exactly where the radio had told us they'd be. The captain gave the signal, our gunner fired. The first shot struck the Tiger's rear plate, and fire burst from its engine. Before the second Tiger could react, our flank tank hit it square in the turret. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute. When the smoke cleared, both Tigers were burning. The half-track tried to flee, but machine gun fire cut it down. We hadn't lost a single man. The radio hissed with more German chatter, confusion, disbelief, panic. I sat there, staring at the tangled mess of wire and tape that had made it possible. It was ugly, reckless, and entirely accidental, but it worked. That night, as we refueled under the weak glow of a lantern, the captain clapped me on the shoulder. "You know," he said, "they'll probably put your name in some manual after this." I laughed softly. "If they do, they'll call it the stupidest trick in the army," he grinned. Then here's to stupid tricks, but even as the men laughed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed into something dangerous. War was supposed to be fought with guns, not wires and nose. Yet here I was, an operator with a broken radio, turning static into a weapon. And I was only getting started. December 29, 1944. The first miracle. Word of what happened spread faster than gunfire. Crews whispered about it between patrols, how one Sherman had somehow outsmarted Tigers, how a piece of twisted wire had turned luck into precision. They called it the miracle of the snow row. I knew better. It wasn't a miracle, it was a mistake I hadn't yet paid for. By then, 3 Tigers had fallen to our platoon in just 48 hours. That was unheard of. Usually, it took 10 Shermans to even wound a Tiger, and half of them never came back. But now, with my radio picking up German frequencies, we moved like ghosts. We knew where they'd be before they even rolled their engines. The captain didn't question the method anymore. Every morning, before we set out, he'd ask, "You got ears on them today?" And I'd nod, already listening through the static. The airwaves were our map, and the snow was our camouflage. The cold never let up. The tank's walls were slick with frost, and our breath hung in the air like smoke. My fingers had split open from the cold, but I didn't dare take off the headset. The Germans' voices were everywhere, sharpened by panic now, filled with orders to regroup, to fall back, to strike elsewhere. They still thought their codes were unbreakable. They didn't know the breach wasn't from some spy or cipher. Just a piece of wire held together by desperation. That morning, we picked up movement near a frozen river bend. 3 enemy tanks and a supply column. The captain decided to ambush. We crawled through the trees, our tracks crunching softly under fresh snow. Through the periscope, I saw their armor glint in the pale light. 3 Tigers, heavy and proud, rumbling in a line. Our gunner whispered, "If this works again, I'll start praying to your radio." The captain gave the signal. The first shot tore through the lead Tiger's rear. The explosion ripped the silence apart. Flames burst out like orange blossoms against the white forest. The second Tiger turned, trying to locate us, but the snow betrayed them. Its glare blinding their optics. Our second Sherman fired and struck its side, a direct hit. The third Tiger tried to flee toward the bridge. I relayed their chatter to the captain. They were calling for backup. He ordered a pursuit. We cut across the ridge, fired once more, and the last Tiger vanished in smoke and fire. 3 giants gone before they even understood how we'd found them. When the echoes faded, the only sound left was the crackling of burning metal. The snow began to fall again, gentle, indifferent, covering both victory and death under the same white shroud. The men cheered. They called me the mad engineer, though I was just a man with frostbitten hands and a lucky accident. But inside, I felt something different await. Each success made me wonder, and fate would balance the scales. That night, as the firelight flickered off the tank's hull, I stared at the wire hanging from the radio. It glowed faintly in the dark, humming with unseen power. For the first time, I understood why they called it a miracle. It wasn't because it saved lives, it was because none of us could explain why. January 1, 1945. The secret in the wire. The new year arrived without fireworks, only the distant thunder of artillery rolling across the frozen hills. The Ardennes were silent otherwise, buried under snow and the ghosts of burned-out tanks. Our Sherman sat half-hidden under camouflage nets, its engine cold, its steel skin rimed with frost. Inside, the air smelled of grease and tobacco. The war had frozen in place, but my mind hadn't stopped racing. The radio sat in front of me, wires cold like veins, humming faintly with life. I'd spent every spare minute refining the connection, tracing each spark that made it possible. I knew what the officers would say if they saw it: unsafe, unauthorized, dangerous. But it worked, and in war, what worked stayed alive. I hadn't told anyone outside the platoon. Not even the mechanics who refueled us at night. The captain agreed it would stay between us. The fewer who knew, the better. If the higher-ups found out, they'd take the radio apart, and with it, our only edge. So we kept it secret. When we bivouacked, I covered the panel with a canvas sheet. When I rewired it, I used my coat to block the light from the lantern. Miller joked that I looked like a doctor performing surgery. Maybe I was. Maybe the tank itself was our patient, and that wire was keeping its heart beating. The others began to copy the setup in their own tanks. We scavenged whatever bits of wire we could find: phone cables, broken fuses, eaten pieces of enemy equipment. Each adaptation was a little different, each one ugly and unstable, but all of them worked just enough to pull whispers from the German frequencies. We weren't intercepting the whole war, just fragments, enough to stay one step ahead. Every time the radio crackled with a new signal, I felt both pride and guilt. Pride that my stupid trick was saving men who might otherwise have burned inside their tanks. Guilt because it had started as an accident, and now it was a secret weapon hidden in plain sight. That night, the captain said, "Keep that wire safe, son. It's worth more than any shell we've got." I looked at it glowing faintly under the weak light, the tape frayed, the copper tarnished. It was just a wire, simple, fragile, meaningless outside the storm of war. But inside that storm, it had become something else entirely. January 3, 1945. The smell of burned iron, the cold that morning was sharper than a knife. Frost clung to every seam of the Sherman, and our breath rose like steam inside the cramped cabin. The engine growled weakly as we moved through a patch of forest reduced to splintered trunks and smoking craters. The snow wasn't white anymore, it was gray, soaked with soot and oil. The radio still worked, though the signal was faint. I could hear pieces of German chatter buried under static movement, numbers, maybe coordinates. The captain leaned close, asking, "Can you pinpoint them?" I nodded, even though I wasn't sure. My hands trembled as I tuned the dial. Something in the wiring sparked. The panel hissed, a thin wisp of smoke curling up from the corner. Before I could fix it, the Tiger found us. The first shell landed short, exploding ahead and rocking the tank like a ship in a storm. Snow and dirt slammed against the hull. The second shot hit closer, the sound so loud it left my ears ringing. Miller screamed for a firing solution. The captain shouted bearings. I could barely hear them. My world was all vibration and heat. Then came the impact. The Tiger's third shell tore into our right side, slicing through the armor but not detonating inside. The shockwave threw me against the radio, knocking the headset from my head. Sparks flew, and the air filled with the stench of burning metal and insulation. For a moment, I thought we were done for. "Bail out," someone yelled. The hatch above clanged open, and freezing air rushed in. I climbed after the others, my gloves slipping on the icy ladder. We threw ourselves into the snow just as fire burst from the engine compartment. I lay there gasping, staring at the Sherman as it burned. The heat melted the snow around it into dark pools. The smell iron, oil, smoke clung to everything. My radio, my invention, was still inside, crackling faintly through the flames. The captain dragged me back to cover, his face blackened with soot. "You alive?" he shouted. I nodded weakly. We watched our tank die in silence. That night, huddled under a tarp with frost settling on our coats, I stared at my trembling hands. The miracle wire, the stupid trick, it had saved us more times than I could count. But against fire and steel, it was still just a wire. And I knew, deep down, the war wasn't finished testing it or me. January 6, 1945. The ambush in the woods. We received new tanks 2 days after losing ours, fresh Shermans with engines that still smelled of factory oil. They felt strange beneath my hands, too clean, too untouched by fear. But before we even started the engines, I was already back inside the radio panel, threading another wire through the steel ribs of the turret. The captain didn't ask questions. He just watched, silent, knowing what that tangle of copper meant for all of us. By dusk, we were moving again. The forest loomed around us, branches heavy with snow, the air filled with the deep silence that comes before something terrible. I tuned the radio as we advanced, catching whispers of German transmissions, short, clipped, urgent. They were close, too close. The captain called in to more platoons. Together, We formed a crescent around a crossroads the enemy was using to push supplies east. Every man knew what was coming. The snow made it worse. Sound traveled strangely, muffled 1 second, magnified the next. Even our own heartbeats felt too loud. Then, through the static, I heard its orders being relayed in German, coordinates matching the very road we were watching. They were coming straight into the trap. I passed the message to the captain, who relayed it down the line. "Hold fire until they commit," he said. The first Tiger appeared minutes later, a dark silhouette moving through the storm. Behind it came 3 more. Their engines thundered like distant drums. The captain's hand hovered over the signal flare. Then red light streaked into the air. The forest erupted. Our Shermans fired in unison, the ground shaking under the recoil. The first Tiger took a round straight to its eye. The second was hit before it could even turn its turret. The radio filled with chaos, German voices shouting, orders breaking apart into panic. I called out their movements, guiding our gunners as they tried to regroup. Left flank turning, I yelled. The captain relayed, and a shell met the enemy tank before it cleared the tree line. Fire and smoke tore through the snow. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. 4 Tigers destroyed, not a single Sherman lost. When the silence returned, the only sound left was the soft crackle of the radio, the faint echo of German voices fading into nothing. The captain turned to me, his breath clouding in the cold. "Whatever that trick of yours is," he said, "it's changed the damn war." I didn't answer. I just stared at the wire, humming quietly under the frost, and wondered how long before it changed me too. January 9, 1945. The Eyes of War. By now, the stories had spread far beyond our platoon. Officers from other units came to see it, the wire, the miracle radio, the crazy accident that let Shermans hear the enemy breathe. Some laughed when they saw the mess of tape and copper. Others stared like they were looking at a relic. I didn't care what they thought. As long as it kept us alive, they could call it witchcraft for all I cared. That morning, a general arrived, snow on his shoulders, stars gleaming dull in the pale light. He was younger than I expected, his expression hard but curious. He climbed into our Sherman and asked to see the setup himself. I showed him the modifications, the bypass stabilizer, the stripped insulation, the extra wire feeding straight into the antenna mount. It looked ridiculous, like a child's science project. "So," he said, "this is what's making ghosts talk." The captain grinned. "Ghosts, sir, or tigers?" "Depends on the day." The general chuckled, but it died quickly, and the radio came alive. A burst of static, then sharp, fast German, an officer giving orders somewhere to the east. I translated as best I could, my pencil scratching over a frozen map. When the general saw the grid reference, his expression changed. That position was one of ours. He ordered immediate confirmation. We relayed the coordinates to command. Minutes later, reports came in: German armor massing near a supply line we'd thought secure. The general said nothing for a long time. Then he looked at me and said quietly, "You just gave eyes to the blind." That phrase stuck with me. Eyes to the blind. It wasn't just the tanks anymore. The whole division began to depend on what my radio could catch. I trained other operators, showing them how to splice wires just so, how to find the edge between frequencies where the German voices hit. Each new Sherman that joined our lines carried a little piece of that accident, that stupid trick born of fear. But as the network grew, so did the noise. Dozens of radios, all tapping the same invisible thread, flooding the air with voices of friend and foe alike. That night, sitting beside the glowing panel, I realized something unsettling. The wire no longer felt like mine. It felt alive, like the war itself was now speaking through it. And I couldn't tell which side it was on anymore. January 12, 1945. The storm in the sky. By mid-January, the snow had turned to ice, and the air itself seemed to hum with tension. The front was shifting again slowly, painfully this time in our favor. Every intercepted message helped us move like shadows ahead of the enemy. But now, we had something new: the sky. Our modified radios weren't just feeding tank-to-tank information anymore. Command had patched us through to the air units' Thunderbolts, the P-47s that prowled the frozen clouds above. For the first time, we could speak directly to the pilots. The thought of hearing friendly engines instead of the dreaded Maybach whir filled me with a strange comfort. That morning, I caught a cluster of transmissions, Germans moving armor through a valley north of our position. I relayed the coordinates up the chain. The captain turned to me, eyes sharp, call it in. Let the sky handle this one. The air buzzed with radio chatter. A pilot's voice cut through the static, calm and confident. Ground unit, this is Eagle 4, confirm grid. I repeated it twice, my voice trembling slightly. A pause, then, confirmed, stay clear. We'll bring the storm. Minutes later, we heard them. The distant hum of engines grew into a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very clouds. The P-47s broke through the overcast, diving low over the valley. From our ridge, we watched streaks of fire rain down, rockets slamming into the trees, explosions blooming like orange flowers across the snow. The ground trembled beneath us. The radio filled with chaos, German officers shouting over one another, panic thick in their voices. I could almost see them through the sound. Tigers trying to turn, crews scrambling for cover, orders drowned by the roar of the planes. It was the first time I ever heard the enemy afraid. When the noise faded, the valley was silent except for the crackle of burning fuel. Smoke rose into the gray sky, twisting into the falling snow. The captain looked over the battlefield, his face pale and still. You did this, he said softly. I shook my head. No, sir. The wire did. For the first time in months, I felt something close to hope. The sky was no longer our enemy. The storm belonged to us now. But deep inside, as the radio hummed quietly, I wondered what would happen when the storm finally ended and what the silence after would sound like. January 15, 1945. The echoes of the wire. The war was still raging, but something had changed. You could feel it in the way we moved, less like prey, more like hunters. Every tank in our company now carried its own version of my stupid trick, each one wired and tuned to listen between the cracks of the air. The result was chaos and clarity all at once. Static filled the channels, but inside it were secret enemy positions, regrouping orders, whispers of retreat. I spent most of my days inside the radio compartment, headphones clamped so tight my ears ached. The voices came in waves, sometimes clear, sometimes buried in noise. Allied transmissions overlapped with German chatter until they became a single, endless drone. I could barely tell where one side ended and the other began. Command had started calling our system Ghostlink, though no one really understood how it worked. The general himself sent word of commendation, but I didn't care for medals or praise. Each victory felt hollow, and I thought of the men who never heard those intercepted warnings in time. One afternoon, as we advanced through another ruined village, the wire picked up something strange, an unfamiliar frequency, a faint German voice repeating coordinates I didn't recognize. They weren't for tanks or artillery, they were for aircraft. I scribbled them down and passed them to the captain. His eyes widened. That's our supply route, he said. They're planning an airstrike. We relayed the information immediately. Within hours, anti-air batteries were repositioned, and when the enemy planes finally came, they flew straight into a wall of fire. Dozens were down before they even reached the front. The men cheered. They said the wire had saved hundreds of lives. But as the noise of celebration faded, I heard something else through the headset, static, rhythmic, almost deliberate. Like breathing, like the war itself whispering back. That night, alone inside the tank, I sat listening to the hum of the radio. The copper wire glowed faintly in the lantern light, alive with unseen current. Every whisper of interference sounded like a memory, voices of friends gone, of Germans shouting, of orders given and taken. It wasn't just a tool anymore. The wire had become something deeper, something that carried the ghosts of everything it touched. And in that moment, I realized, the war would end someday, but the echoes would never stop. January 20, 1945. The frozen victory, the battle for the Ardennes was ending. You could feel it in the stillness of the forest, the way the guns fell silent for longer stretches, the way the smoke no longer rose in endless pillars. The Germans were retreating, leaving behind wrecks half buried in snow. But victory didn't feel like triumph, it felt tired, heavy, and cold. Our Sherman sat at the edge of a shattered village, its armor scarred, its paint scorched from near misses. Snow had frozen around the treads, locking the tank in place like a monument to everything we had endured. I climbed out of the hatch that morning, boots crunching on ice, and looked around. The world was quiet for the first time in months. Inside, the radio still hummed faintly. The wire was there too, my wire, black tape peeling, copper darkened with heat and smoke. It had become more than a piece of equipment. It was a symbol, the silent thread that had kept us alive. Through that fragile lie, we had heard the enemy's plans, turned their strength against them, and given our tanks a chance to fight back. Now that the fighting was fading, the headset felt heavier every time I put it on. The airwaves were emptier, carrying only the weak chatter of Allied convoys and the occasional fading German distress call. No more orders, no more fear in their voices, just echoes. The captain came over, his coat dusted with snow. "They're calling it secure," he said. "The bulge is finished." He looked at me, then at the radio. "Guess your trick did its part." I nodded, unsure what to say. Part of me wanted to believe it mattered, that the wire had changed something more than just a few battles. But all I could think of were the faces of the men who hadn't lived to see this silence. As night fell, I climbed back into the Sherman. The metal was freezing, the air sharp and dry. I turned the dial one last time, just to hear it hum. Static filled my ears, soft, endless, familiar. For a moment, I thought I heard voices again. Maybe memory, maybe ghosts. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the sound of freedom, quiet, fragile, and cold as the snow covering everything we'd fought to survive. February 2nd, 1945. The Lost Report. When the shooting finally stopped, Command began collecting stories, field reports, after-action notes, technical logs. They wanted data, not memories. So I wrote it down. Every detail of the wire, the frequencies, the strange interference that had let us hear the enemy. I described how we had turned an accident into an advantage, how a broken circuit had changed the rhythm of battle. I signed it Corporal James R. Walker, radio operator, 3rd Armored Division, and handed it to the logistics officer with frozen fingers. He nodded without looking up. "We'll make sure it gets to the top." Weeks passed. Snow melted into gray mud, and tanks rolled through the thawing fields toward new fronts. The war moved on, and my report disappeared into the tide of paperwork. When I asked about it later, no one had heard of it. The officer had been transferred, the records misplaced, the forms under review. It was as if the wire had never existed. I tried not to care. After all, it wasn't glory I wanted, it was to live. But part of me couldn't help wondering if the truth was being buried under the same snow that had once saved us. The army didn't like miracles it couldn't explain, especially when they came from the wrong kind of soldier, one who improvised instead of obeyed. One evening, while packing for redeployment, I found a small envelope tucked inside my logbook. Inside was a carbon copy of my report, unsigned, with a note scribbled in pencil, filed in technical archives, status, classified. No name, no signature, just that. I stared at the paper for a long time, listening to the faint hum of a nearby generator. Outside, men laughed, sang, burned fuel to stay warm. The war had become a story now, one already being rewritten by those who survived it with cleaner hands. I folded the note and slipped it into my coat pocket. If no one else remembered the wire, I would. Maybe someday someone would find the real report, or maybe it would vanish forever under layers of bureaucracy and dust. Either way, I knew what it had done. I had seen what one desperate spark of thought could change in the middle of hell. And if the world chose to forget, the war never would. May 8, 1945. The sound of freedom. The war ended on a spring morning that smelled of smoke and wet earth. The guns had fallen silent at last, but the silence itself felt strange, almost fragile. I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the Sherman's hull, a soft rhythm instead of the thunder I'd grown used to. For the first time in years, the air didn't taste like iron. We were stationed on the edge of a ruined village in Germany. The people came out of their cellars slowly, faces pale, eyes hollow. Some waved white rags, others just stared. Our captain stood on the tank, hat off, looking east where the clouds were breaking. "It's over," he said quietly. "It's finally over." Inside the Sherman, the radio still sat where it always had, silent now, its tangled wire dark with age and grime. I ran my fingers along it, tracing the line that had once carried voices, warnings, lies. It had been my weapon, my shield, my curse. Through that wire, I'd heard death coming before it reached us. Through it, I'd turned panic into precision. Now there was nothing left to hear. I pulled the wire free, slowly, carefully, as if it might still be alive. It came loose with a faint metallic sigh. I coiled it around my hand, the copper biting lightly into my palm. I thought of the nights in the snow, of the static that had become my heartbeat, of the men who hadn't lived to see the silence. The captain saw what I was holding and smiled faintly. "You keeping that thing?" "Yeah," I said. "Guess I owe it more than I can explain." He nodded and walked away, boots sinking into the mud. As the day wore on, I sat by the tank, watching the clouds drift apart. Planes flew overhead, ours this time peaceful, slow, their engines no longer a warning. The rain faded, and somewhere a church bell rang, thin and distant. I wound the wire tighter, then tucked it into my coat pocket, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how survival can come from madness, of how a single broken circuit could rewrite the rhythm of war. The world was quiet again. But in that silence, beneath the calm of peace, I could still hear it, the faint echo of static, the sound of freedom being born.